Hello, everyone, and welcome to another conversation on the Centennial of Portuguese Radio in California. According to Dr. Eduardo Meyon Dias, Professor Emeritus from UCLA, it was exactly on June the 10th of 1920 that a man from the island of Terceira by the name of José Vitorino began what was then the very first Portuguese language program in California, and actually the same time that radio began. We're celebrating the 100th anniversary of radio stations in the United States, also around 1919, 1920. So it's amazing. We have with us, as all of you can see, Davide Vieira, uh, whose father was a pioneer in Portuguese radio stations in California, who's been involved in the Portuguese radio just about all of his life, probably longer than he really wanted to be. David, thank you so much for joining us. It's just a plain conversation for us to have with those who follow us on social media, and at the same time to archive this as part of the centennial celebration that we are doing at the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute at Fresno State. So welcome.
Thank you, Denise. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. If you don't mind, a little bit of background. I know that lots of people in California know you, but for archival information, a little bit of history of your family from the Azores to California. I know that your dad is an immigrant. I don't know if your mom was or if she was born here, but there's a wonderful book that I would encourage everyone to read. But for those who don't read as much or haven't read the book about the life of Mr. Batista Vieira, can you tell us a little bit about the history, if you don't mind?
Sure. My father is an immigrant. He immigrated in 1954 with his brother, his older brother, Albert. Albert was 18. My father was almost 16. And they were deposited at different dairies. My father in Milpitas, my uncle up in the North Bay, San Rafael, I believe. And thus they were apart. Their mother brought them here, my grandmother, and then she went back to the Azores because she had smaller children that she still had back there. So my mother, on the other hand, was born here, as was my grandmother. Mm. My mother's grandparents, my great-grandparents, were immigrants from San Jorge. And they actually immigrated here separately and found each other here and married, even though they were from the same village in San Jorge. Wow. Which is kind of weird. I mean, they found each other again, obviously, in this country and were married. This was in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They were married in the early 1900s. And then he bought some acreage in San Jose, almost 100 acres, and paid it off for several years, many years, actually about 15 years, and paid it off in full, and then died of the pandemic of the 1918, 1920.
Wow.
So as did two of his small sons, who would have been my great uncles, I guess.
Yes, yeah.
So, wow. And that's a bit about the family history. Yeah, my mother is second generation born here, and my father's an immigrant from San Jorge. I got to mention San Jorge.
Oh, you've had to mention San Jorge because you're full-blooded San Jorge.
No. My mother has Fayal, actually.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
My grandfather was from Fayal, and he was an immigrant as well. 1912, he immigrated and met my grandmother, and were married in 1924, I believe. So it's always, it's an immigrant story.
Right. Always in the Bay Area, David.
Yeah, always in the Bay Area.
Okay.
My father immigrated here directly. Didn't have any way stations along the way, and then obviously my great grandparents and my mother's father was also an immigrant. They came directly here.
And of course, those who know the family history, your father was involved, still is, I'm sure, in construction, and of course and has different properties throughout the state of California. But tell us a little bit how he got involved in radio. Of course, he was one of the three KRVE, Rosa, Vieira, and Esteves. And of those three, one of them was a radio man. Joaquim Esteves is like a famous icon in the 1960s and 70s. And how did your father get involved in this?
Well, back in the early 70s, Mr. Esteves, Joaquim Esteves, had his radio program, Portugal de Hoje, and I believe it was daily. And he had been buying hours on other radio stations. KLOK was one of them. He'd bought on a lot of different stations, you know, because stations would let you buy hours and then they would change formats. And then they'd basically say, okay, goodbye, it was nice knowing you. And then you'd go find another station to buy hours on. So he had been doing that for many, many years. And then in the early 70s, he figured it was about time to try to buy a station for Portuguese language programming. So he put out a call, you know, he talked to his friends, talked to his acquaintances, and in fact, had lined up, they had 10 to 12 people lined up to buy this station. However, when it came time to write the check, only 3 of them ponied up. And that was obviously Mr. Esteves, Josie Rosa, and then my father, Batista Vieira. Ironically, or coincidentally, Denise, 46 years ago, on this day at 11 a.m. is when KRVE launched.
That is a coincidence. I'm glad we're having this conversation. It was purely coincidental. I did not know. Interesting.
July 2nd, yes, July 2nd, 1974. So that's 46 years today.
And so when they began the stations, how did your father feel about that? A man who was not really involved in radio. I mean, obviously, James was excited because now he owned part of something that he was paying others. But how did your father, you know, feel about that, if you recall?
Well, you know, he was an entrepreneur. Obviously, he was in construction, had his own company since 1963, and had been buying a lot of properties. So being entrepreneurial and very proud of being Portuguese, obviously, Portuguese from the Azores. It was a risk, obviously, but it was a risk that could not just be a good business decision, but be a good decision for the Portuguese community and be a resource and a public service for the Portuguese community in the Bay Area. So that's essentially, you know, I mean, radio is a business too, you know, so he wasn't going in this as to be a charity, obviously. So it had to be successful. It had to earn its keep. And that's the way Joe Rosa and Mr. Esteves felt as well. And that's probably why the other 9 or 10 or however bailed before the finish line. So, and they did for various reasons. I don't even know who they were or what the reasons were. I just know that there were 10 or 12 total that were being lined up to purchase. The station was KTAO originally, was its call letters.
Okay, so it was, the station existed, in other words. It was.
Yeah, it existed. It was, my father says there were a bunch of hippies. And in fact, I look at the pictures and I remember back on that day, and you literally had to step over some dogs in the studio just to get from one room to the other. They had dogs, and it was interesting. It was the 60s kind of morphed into the 70s, and I was a young and impressionable teenager at the time, so I thought it was kind of a interesting experience on that day, that the changing of the guard at KTAO. Interestingly enough, though, the original call letters the 3 wanted them to be KEVR, not KRVE. And however, KEZR opposed it to the FCC when it went out for review, and changed the call letter similar in KEZR's opinion to have KEVR. So it was KRVE, and And even funny enough, the owners of KEZR, they were part Portuguese, very, very much removed
Right.
from their heritage, but they did have some Portuguese in them. I knew them. Our kids went to school together years ago, so it was kind of interesting.
And so when KRV began, it then it was the mothership, let's put it this way, for all the existing Portuguese radio programs in California, because Mr. Stips continued doing his own show, his own style, and many others came to KRV, correct?
Yeah, there was Mr. Stivge and what I've been told, 23 others,
Okay.
independents.
Right.
So there were 24 shows or 24 programs on the original KRVE. Many of the independents had some radio training. They had been on the radio in Portugal or the Azores, Madeira, or even in the Portuguese colonies. So some of them had some training, but by and large they were amateur radio programmers, and they had their audiences and they had their purposes, and it was a good relationship there in the beginning when you're trying to get a radio station up and running. And it was a 24-hour station, so overnight we had English language programming, and we had some employees that came in overnight to do the programming, and one of them actually is still in the business. She's program director at, guess where? She's program director at KRTY. And KRTY is the successor to KRVE.
Ah, interesting.
So she's a program director at KRTY, the former KRVE at 95.3 FM. So it's just weird. And she remembers to this day, her name is Julie Stevens. She remembers to this day Mr. Stivge and my father and Joe Rosa. And she's pushing 60 at this point in her life.
And so when you have, so KRVE existed for quite a few years there. Tell us a little bit about the transition, because then Mr. Stibbs, of course, disappeared. We don't know what happened to Mr. Stibbs, but and then, but before then, it kind of took a different transition, and your father went his way, of course, and we'll talk about that. But a little bit about that history, if you don't mind.
Sure. Actually, Mr. Stibbs wanted to retire a few years after KRV started. He wanted to retire, so Joe Rosa and my father bought out his third of the station, and Mr. Stibbs went off and retired. So Joe and my father continued along the same lines, but at a point they said, well, things are fine. We could continue this way. But they thought that maybe they should be improving the programming by adding professional radio personalities to the mix. So they did some research, made some phone calls, and where are you going to find these folks? Obviously, we don't have them on the West Coast, but they do have them on the East Coast. They have them in the Azores. They have them in Portugal. So José João de Encarnação was on the East Coast. I believe he was doing radio for WJFD.
Correct. Yeah.
And my father and Joe made him an offer he couldn't refuse. So here comes João, the consummate professional, the late José João.
Yes.
He passed away last September. I believe it was in September. And here he came. So he was given not free rein, because that's not the way my father works or Joe works, but he was given a lot of rein to transform the station into a more professional enterprise. And later with that came Mario Vargas and Titreville and others later. I mean, the history goes on after that. But that was essentially, it was a business decision. It was like, if we could go this way and we'd be okay, but to be really successful and to make a mark on the community and this segment of radio, ethnic radio or foreign language radio, that was the decision, and that's why it was made. And with the success that KRVE had by becoming a more professional enterprise, that allowed other acquisitions, right? And then came KLBS. KLBS was already functioning as KRVE had been functioning. KLBS sold hours, and there were many Portuguese programs, independent programs on KLBS at the time. And that kind of continued along that vein as well after Joe and my father purchased KLBS. And there were some management changes over the years. And then finally, José João, my father hired José João back because José João, was out of radio for a while. Hired José João back, and he converted KLBS into a much more professional enterprise as well. The independents started falling off, and José João brought in others like Alvaro. Well, Alvaro Vieira actually came to KSQQ. I mean, we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves, but KLBS very much was converted. Maria de Lourdes das Vacas, Alvaro Aguiar, Alfred Cunha, more up here than down there. I mean, we've got a list, and it's a very incomplete list, but over the years, people, José João, Mário Vargas, Tito Ravil, Alfred Cunha, Maria de Lourdes das Vacas, Ida Barbosa, Álvaro Aguiar, Tony Silveira, now Father Antonio Silveira, Jean Conscience, César de Jesus, Filomena Rocha, Isilda Azevedo, Antonio Tencourt, Arnaldo Ferreira, and then the part-timers, João Manuel Dias, consummate professional as well. José Mendonça, Luís Cordeiro, Nelo Betancourt, Rosa Ávila, Elia Severino, Lícia Brazil. They've all contributed. The full-timers, obviously, and the part-timers as well. I mean, João Manuel, José Mendonça has a huge following on KLBS. So that's kind of the way that KLBS came about. The success of KRVE led to the acquisition of KLBS. But then again, a few years later, 1987, I think, 82, KLBS was purchased. 87, Joe Rosa and my father decided to split. And it was amicable, and decided to split. And my father says he gave Joe the option of which station he wanted to keep, and Joe chose KRVE. My father obviously ended up with KLBS. And then Joe took KRVE a different direction. And we know, it converted to English language, and then he had the subcarrier frequency with the special radio receiver that you needed to receive the Portuguese programming. And that continued for a few years until the new frequency came along, a new frequency came along in the Bay Area, 96.1. Actually, that was found by our engineer, or it was curated by our engineer, but that doesn't mean you get to keep it. It has to go to auction. And so KSQQ was on the auction block, the 96 point. It wasn't KSQQ, it was a frequency.
Right.
You give it the call letters after the fact. But 96.1 in the Bay Area on a particular contour, you have a contour, stations have their areas, legal areas of transmission. If they bleed over it, that's fine, as long as nobody complains. But you have a contour that you have to adhere to as your broadcast area. So.
And what year was that, so that your father started KSQQ?
1989 was when.
So a couple years after he and Joe Rosa had the split, and he had left KRVE.
Yeah. And 89, and then you go through the process, you get the attorneys, you do the auction, and then typically you get a bunch of people who, for various reasons, they either want the station or they just want some money to go away. So one strategy is, if there's 7 people or 6 or 5 or 4, whatever, you just say, okay, we'll all buy it together. And then whoever among the group wants out, then the others just buy them out. So there were actually six parties who purchased 96.1. And then my father started buying them off. And he bought all of them off. He bought 4 of them off. And then there was one left, who still is a minority owner of KSQQ. And his name is Peter Muley. His family brought the Warriors to the Bay Area. Actually, his father was the first beer concessionaire for the San Francisco Giants. And then that obviously made some acquisitions possible for him. He was very successful. And the Muley family today owns 10% of the 49ers. So Peter Muley is a minority partner in KSQQ to this day. But my father, with 83, 84%, whatever that is, managing general partner, obviously. Sure. But the station took a while to kick off because, it was brand new frequency. You need a transmitter site. You need studios, offices, and equipment, obviously. And the thing is that the frequency was licensed to Morgan Hill. Now, the transmitter location, the first transmitter location was in Morgan Hill. And it was in kind of a really bad, not really bad, but bad enough place that KSQQ couldn't be heard very well, unfortunately, in East San Jose. It was spotty because there was a hill in the way in Morgan Hill. And the studios were also first installed in Morgan Hill, down off of the downtown, off of Dunn Avenue, I think it was. And it's like, well, we got a problem. We bought this thing and we want it to be Portuguese and we wanted people to hear it, but it's not hitting East San Jose that great. So nothing that a whole bunch of money can't fix. So then started the process to move the transmitter and the studios to San Jose. And a great transmitter site was found. We have a great engineer, always have. We've had great engineers all along. We've only had, I think, two or three different engineers in 46 years. So we found this great site. It's 1,000 feet up above Calero Reservoir in the Almaden Valley of Santa Clara Valley. It's a great site. It's the second best site in the valley. The first best site is half a mile that way to the east, and we can see their antenna from our antenna. And we have clear line of sight all the way to San Francisco. Although we can't transmit to San Francisco, you can hear us there. Yeah, we have clear line of sight all the way up to the peninsula and all the way up to the East Bay as well. You can see both downtown San Francisco and Oakland on a clear day. So that first little hiccup resulted in us moving to San Jose, which is where it was the goal all along, really. And obviously the studios were relocated to Little Portugal, the official area, which is an actual area in San Jose, recognized by the city as Little Portugal. So in about 1984 is when we opened the studios in San Jose.
And it's been there ever since, obviously.
I've been there ever since, although we did build new studios in 2009 on the same property, just behind the existing building. KSQQ had its original studios were cramped, and in 2009, my father, on the same property, decided to build some nicer studios, bigger studios, and they're really nice. 3 studios, multiple offices, and it's really top of the line studio. He always does top of the line, regardless. Whether it's in Los Banos. We have 2 stations in Los Banos. We have the Spanish language station as well, KQLB 106.9 FM. Since the 90s, I mean, it's been a long time having KQLB online as well. And my parents have purchased other radio stations and made some trades, and there's some business maneuverings as well. They had a station in Healdsburg for a few years and a station in Patterson. It didn't last, I'm not saying it didn't last too long. They didn't have it too long. They made a trade, I think, with another radio owner. They're actually a very powerful radio company owned by a gentleman named Amador Bustos. He's top of the in Spanish. in the U.S. So there's business moves, and then KSQQ has a translator that came in 2009 as well, so that we could extend the reach into Hollister and San Juan Batista, because KSQQ is licensed basically from Gilroy to Palo Alto, and then up into Fremont. That's a rough estimate of the contour map for KSQQ. KLBS is a little bit different because it's non-directional during the day and directional at night. So and the power is reduced at night as well. So KLBS is different. KQLB is FM, and it's non-directional, obviously, because it's FM.
Okay.
So
now KLBS is strictly Portuguese still, or most?
Oh yeah, it's strictly Portuguese, and it's our own people. There aren't any independents Portuguese independents on either station. Of course, KSQQ hours things have changed over the years. The viability of Portuguese radio in the Bay Area has diminished, while the viability in the San Joaquin Valley has maintained fairly a decent equilibrium. But here in the Bay Area, independents on KSQQ, Chinese independents for the most part. Then Portuguese radio, Portuguese hours are reduced during the week, and then most of the weekend it's in Portuguese. Most of Saturday, well, all of Sunday really, and much of Saturday is still in Portuguese all day.
And how many hours during Monday through Friday in Portuguese?
Well, it's 24/7 on the subcarrier frequency.
Okay, so
but on the generally available FM, it's 2 hours a day on the weekdays, and then on the order from 18 to 24. I think it's 18 on Saturday and 24 on Sunday. So that's all day Sunday.
And then the other time is, of course, other ethnic radios. I mean, other languages. You said mainly Chinese.
Yeah, Chinese. Really, we've had other languages besides Chinese, but right now it's all Chinese. Okay. The independents, and there's about six or seven independents who have different numbers of hours during the weekdays and weekends.
Let me ask you the $64,000 question, and that is, as we move forward, I mean, the Vieira family has been a staple in Portuguese radio, as you mentioned. First of all, and one of the first conversations we had, I had also the pleasure of having here. Last name is Ahuda. I can't think of Paulina Ahuda, who and her husband are the owners of WJFD in New Bedford, as you know. And she was saying one of the hardest things to do sometimes is to convince your employees that we're doing this as a service to the community. Yes, but we are also a business. I mean, this is one of our businesses, so we have to keep this as a business. Before I ask this, the other $64,000 question, a little bit of a backdrop to that. So your father has always taken this as a business, but by the same token, a business that has served the community and made it viable, because if it wasn't viable, it would have served the community all these years.
Yeah, my father's not in the business of supporting unprofitable businesses. That's counter to it. That's not business. That's charity. Yeah, that's charity. Although, to tell you the honest truth, the Chinese subsidize the Portuguese here and on KSQQ. Okay, like I said, Portuguese radio in the Bay Area has become less and less viable. So that's where the Chinese come in, and the KSQQ is radio value has gone down obviously over the years, over the decades, with the advent of so many more options on the internet and cable television and satellite and streaming and everything else. So radio obviously has lost value. Stations have lost value. AM stations, you literally can't give them away anymore. You can't give them away. So the thing is, Chinese, point blank, it's subsidizing the Portuguese programming. In Los Banos, it's carrying its own, not as much as in its heyday, but it's holding its own.
How do you see this in the future? I mean, the community is changing. We've talked about this, many times. We talk about this at different venues in the community, whether it be the council meetings from wherever. I've spoken with your dad about this when I had the privilege of being with him for a full day in São Jorge inside his home, and we had a wonderful time. And I've always had the most respect for him. But at that time, he already showed some concerns. We're talking about, I think, 4 or 5 years ago when him and I were together, about the future of Portuguese radio, even in the Valley, where you're still, basically, we still are dedicating a full-time radio station to Portuguese. But as you mentioned, in the Bay Area, the Chinese are subsidizing the 2 hours of Portuguese and the Portuguese on the weekends. And so, because it's no longer viable, how do you see the communities changing? Because this change that's going on in the Bay Area will probably soon happen in the Valley. The community is becoming much more Americanized and less Portuguese. So how do you, having all this experience, and I'm sure conversations with your parents, how do you see this going forward?
Well, the secret to radio, it's really not a secret. It's you got to put on the air a product that entertains and informs, and then you have a shot at success. That doesn't mean you're going to be successful. Collaboration is key. You got to put out a product that people want. Businesses have to advertise. Listeners have to patronize those businesses. It becomes a win-win-win. Anytime one of those wins doesn't happen, there's a problem. And typically stations go away. We're seeing it here in the Bay Area. A long-standing AM station just went out of business. It literally couldn't even be given away. How we see it, the Portuguese are going to assimilate. They already are, obviously, right? I mean, the last greatest immigration ended in the early 80s. There have been trickles, 2 or 3 here and there, not many. But immigration essentially ended almost 40 years ago. And again, the immigrants are aging, and they're leaving this world. And they're the ones who needed most the Portuguese language broadcasting. Others, for purpose of nostalgia, will tune in, obviously the younger ones. So how long is it going to take? It's a really good question. But it's coming sooner than a lot of people think, when it's no longer viable, even in the San Joaquin Valley. The Valley is a little bit different. As you know, you're in Tulare. It takes 30 minutes to get anywhere from anywhere. Right? People tend to be more, I don't want to say stuck in place, but more sedentary because they live and work on ranches and dairies and farms, and it's a different culture than the Bay Area. It's a different way of life. So radio still is a part of people's lives, probably less time than in its heyday. And when I say its heyday, I say the 70s through the 90s was really Portuguese radio's heyday. It was KRVE through the early days of KSQQ, when we still had full-time employees doing Portuguese 24/7. Right. So it is what it is here in the Bay Area. Here it will end sooner than I anticipate in the San Joaquin Valley. But then again, a lot of stuff can change. I mean, my parents are here today. They're in their 80s, and they're not going to be here forever.
Sure.
And there are taxes to be paid, and things have to be squared away with the government. There's a lot of stuff that's going to happen when my parents are no longer with us, that my brother and I are going to have to take care of, and we're not relishing that eventuality by any means. The tough decisions will have to be made. That said, my father has said in the past, if any Portuguese individual wants to, or any individual period, Portuguese or non-Portuguese, but if someone wants to buy these stations, KLBS actually primarily, and continue with the purpose of continuing Portuguese radio, he would sell it to them, right? Because then he would, guarantee to the best of his ability that it would continue Portuguese for some period of time in the future. Sure. Because he's getting old. He's getting older. I mean, I'd like to be as vivacious and alive as he is.
We all would.
Yeah, when if I get to my 80s, right? But he's still calling all the shots. even, you know, at this age. He may say that his sons are calling the shots, but I don't believe it. I do take care of the technology. I take care of the computer systems, and we have a lot of systems, not just computers, but codec boxes and everything else that goes into transmitting from remote locations in-house, bringing broadcasting in-house, transmissions in-house. But he's the business guy. I mean, he's still calling the shots at his age. Not me and Joe.
Yeah. And as we end this time, and I really thank you for taking this time to give us this history of the Vieira family history in radio. I wrote many years ago, and I still say that I can't imagine the Portuguese communities in California, in Central and Northern California, without the Vieira family's investments in Portuguese radio. It would have been a total different community. Just like we would have been a total different community had we not had those pioneers of the 1930s and 40s. Yeah. You know, the Turavilas and the Nelo Clementinos and all those who pioneered this that then allowed a KRVE and allowed a KSQQ and a KLVS and other experiments that have happened in California, not many others in Portuguese radio, on open air radio. But how has the pandemic, because it's been with us for 3 months now, how is the pandemic, and something that will probably be with us, unfortunately, for a little while, how's that affected radio itself? And of course, the business community that is suffering because people are not going to restaurants as they used to, and they're not going out as they used to. So there's lots of different things. The Portuguese festas are non-existent, basically, other than, you know, some creative things like Father Silveira has done and a few others. But the Portuguese festas are non-existent throughout the whole entire area. And I think, especially in the Valley, correct me if I'm wrong, David, but I think in the Valley, they're an important part to KLBS because it moves, you know, goods and advertisers that then want to have their name out there when you're broadcasting the festa or talking about the festa. So how do you see the pandemic affecting Portuguese radio that already has this $64,000 question in the few, you know, whether it be half a dozen years or a dozen years, but how does it affect it today?
Well, it obviously affects it. The festivals are our major revenue stream for KLBS. To a lesser extent, KSQQ. I mean, it is a major revenue stream up here, but there's just fewer festivals. There's fewer. It's a different model in the Valley than it is here in the Bay Area. So yeah, the loss of the festivals is a big deal. Obviously, the loss of the sponsors or cutting back of the sponsors on their advertising, another big deal. So there's been some business decisions made. My father's made some business decisions with staffing, and but that's just a little Band-Aid on a much bigger wound of what the pandemic has done to business. You know, like I said, it's a collaboration between businesses and us and our listeners. And when businesses are hurting, we're hurting. My father has done some minor things that are going to help a little, but it's tough. I mean, the next few months we'll see where we're going. I mean, business is coming back. Festas are not going to come back anytime soon, but business is coming back, and we'll just have to see how much business is coming back, because many businesses only come back at 50%, and they won't be back to 100% for a while. And we're talking, it could be years before some of these businesses ramp up to where they were before, depending on what sector they're in. But it's, you know, radio, Portuguese radio, it's going to be there. I don't foresee it going away because of this pandemic. It's just people are hurting. I mean, and we're fine. I mean, it's we'll survive. But I'm more worried about our Portuguese business people, some of whom will never return Their businesses will never return. And the festas, you know,
I was going to ask you about that.
these halls, they got property taxes to pay.
Right.
They've got, you know, a lot of them are 501c3s, but they still got a tax burden to pay. And they're not, there's no revenue. You know, they're not renting their halls for the weddings and the quinceañeras and the birthday parties and baptisms and everything else. And they still got bills to pay. Same thing with the bands. Same thing with the clubs, the Benficas and the Sportings and the Casa dos Açores and everything you've got up in the valley as well. So I'm afraid that some of these halls may not survive the pandemic. And they were a lot of them were already on a razor's edge. Right. I mean,
that's the concern. You know, and that's why I wanted to get your thoughts on that. I know it's not directly related to radio, but it is because, you know, the Portuguese radio doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists because the Portuguese make their living in California, and in your case, serving Central and Northern California, and the Portuguese organizations are such an important part of our social and our cultural calendar. So, as someone who's been involved in the community and someone who's on the advisory board to the consuls in San Francisco, I've had these discussions on other topics as well. As far as the community, are you of the idea? There's kind of two train of thoughts here, and I'd like to get your thoughts on that as we close. Which is, some people think that, you know, things will, if they go back to some sense of normality next year, that things will be bigger and better. And some people are of the aspect that, well, some of these organizations were already just kind of living on a shoestring, and this is kind of the basically the nexus that came through for them to disappear or for them to, you know, scale back to something totally different. How do you see these two train of thoughts? Will these be able to? Will everything just be the same starting next year, or will this actually hurt some of the organizations that were already living on a shoestring?
It's definitely going to hurt them. It's not going to be the same as it was before. A lot of these organizations have mortgages payable to banks, not necessarily to individuals. Regardless, I mean, individuals or banks, these notes can be called, right? And if you can't pay your mortgage, then you lose your building. And if these organizations lose their buildings, I'm talking marching bands, I'm talking sport clubs, I'm talking cultural groups. If they can't pay their mortgage, they're gone. So I don't think things will return to the way they were. Will the ones that remain be stronger? It's possible, because the people who go under, the organizations that don't survive, hopefully the people from the other organizations can bolster the ones that remain. For instance, I've always been of the opinion, if we have 4 marching bands within throwing distance here, three immediately in basically the same neighborhood, and then Santa Clara. We've got 13, 14 marching bands up and down the state of California. Could you imagine how great it would be to put together one marching band of 500 members in the Rose Parade? But instead we have a lot of smaller bands, and they're all good, but they're all small marching bands, and these are some of the ones that are living on the razor's edge with mortgages and payments to make and property taxes to pay and whatnot.
And does the community warrant that? In other words, will the community even support that, even without a pandemic, you know, for marching bands within such a short area? I mean, we have them here in the Valley, but, you know, they're like 2.5 hours apart, so it's a little bit different situation. But, you know, if there were 2 bands in Tulare, or 1 band in Tulare, 1 band in Hanford, 25 miles away, it probably, you know, wouldn't survive. So I think even without the pandemic, it's time will tell, but even without the pandemic, it's something that probably made sense in the 1970s, but doesn't make sense today.
Right. I mean, they're for members, they're dipping into schools, you know, middle schools where bands become, you know, they're getting members outside the Portuguese community, and that's fine. They're still playing the Portuguese songs. They're still playing the marches. They're still playing the traditional music. But I mean, frankly, there have been conversations. Some of these bands have already asked the question, you know, should we continue? And so far they've said yes. But you know, it's getting difficult to even field directors, boards of directors for organizations here. There have been organizations here, I could throw a baseball and hit two of them from my house. Two organizations that couldn't field boards of directors. And in their bylaws, if they don't field a board of directors within X amount of time, you know, they've got to dissolve the corporation. So this was before the pandemic, and imagine now with what we're going through, the deck is stacked against a lot of these organizations, and it was going to be just a matter of time, and the pandemic may have accelerated that decline, and that's unfortunate. But then again, if the people can join together with the organizations that remain, then you know, make them stronger and keep staffing the boards of directors that these organizations need to survive, then we got a shot to keep the rest. But you know, we used to have 99 Holy Ghost societies, Irmandades do Espírito Santo in California. There were 99 in their heyday, which I'm assuming was probably in 1930s, 40s, 50s. And since then, a lot have fallen by the wayside. It's inevitable.
Right.
I mean, look at KRVE and its beginnings. We had independence, not just Portuguese independence, but we had some other languages too. We had German and Italian, and in fact, it was a quite well-known German show. The personality was very popular among the German community. Well, they're done, right? I mean, they went X number of years in the 70s, probably, maybe they made it into the 80s, I don't remember. But then they disappeared because they didn't have their audience. And we're losing our audience too. In fact, I used to say, you know, I'm right here by Five Wounds Church, and now it's different now because you can't really have funerals, or they have to be very small, and most people aren't even doing them in the churches anymore, at least here. But when we used to hear the bell ring, it's like that. There's one less listener.
Yeah, your father and I commented that when we were in the Azores in San Jorge at your home, which was he made kind of the comment that every time someone elderly lost their life or, you know, died in the Portuguese American community, sometimes it'd be a whole family that would tune off Portuguese radio, because sometimes it was grandpa or grandmother who, you know, kept the radio on, and so the children and the grandchildren had to listen to it. And it was a very wise point, I still remember, because I think he's absolutely right. I mean, it's just sometimes when an older person dies, you kind of lose the whole family because the whole family is into something else now.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's the story of immigration.
Correct.
And assimilation.
German was the number one language taught in the United States of America after English in 1900, and there are hardly any high schools teaching German any longer. You know, it wasn't Spanish in the 1900s, and the same thing with of course with French, and you know, it's fun.
I mean, it's amazing the work that you're doing and others have done over the decades to keep Portuguese alive in the schools and in the universities, all the way from elementary up through high school and the universities and colleges, because you know, other languages have not been so lucky, right?
That's true.
I mean, who goes to college to study German, whereas we have people going to college to learn Portuguese, of course. Right. And Portuguese is a tremendous opportunity with Brazil, with what, 200 plus million people. And then, you know, Portugal's got its 10 or 11 million, but the economic opportunities are tremendous for learning the Portuguese language. So it's great. I mean, even many years ago, decades ago, my uncle, he married my father's sister. He needed to learn Portuguese because he was going to go to Brazil he needed enough Portuguese to get by because he was going on a business some period of time in Brazil. So he went to class at Mission College, which was being taught by my aunt, Portuguese class at Mission College. And then they met and fell in love, and they've been together for 40 plus years.
That's a lovely story. Portuguese brings people together and brings.
Yeah, that's a great slogan. Yeah, feel free to trademark it.
We got to use that one. Well, David, thank you so much for your time. We took a little bit longer than I wanted to, not to waste your time. I know that you're retired, but you still have a lot of things to do. But I want to thank you so much for your time. Thank you for telling the family the story of the Vieira family and your contributions to Portuguese radio and to the community in general. Batista Vieira, your father, has been very, 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 very gracious and very generous with many Portuguese American organizations, and very generous, I should say, and I want this archived also, with many organizations in the islands, especially the island of São Jorge and the island of Terceira. And so thank you so much for your time. Hopefully we will be having a conversation again in a few years, and KLBS and KSQQ will still be Portuguese, but we know that these are tough times. And thanks for sharing this history. We want to archive this at Fresno State. It's part of our Portuguese Oral History Project, because if we go back, we don't have a lot of it, unfortunately, and it's time that we do that. And I actually would like to, even the opportunity when this opens up, to spend some time with your father one-to-one and record him, because we do these in Portuguese and English, obviously, and a little bit more of his story rather than the story that's in the book. So thank you again. We appreciate it very, very much, and we learned a lot of stuff from the Vieira involvement in Portuguese radio and the Portuguese community, and from this wonderful thing, not wonderful that it happened, but that we know about the story of your ancestors that died during the pandemic of 100 years ago. That's something that we don't have a lot of history. We don't have a lot of written history about the Portuguese presence in the pandemic of 1918, 1919 here in California. And there were lots of immigrants at that time. My own grandfather was here. He just went back to Portugal, and my grandmother, but they were both here in 1918, 1919. So thanks for sharing that with us. I appreciate it as well.
You're very welcome. It was a pleasure chatting with you, Denise.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.